Dust fell from the cracking roof of the bunker, the earth churning meters above the war room. The surviving generals were scrambling around the data table, trying to resist the orbital bombardment, with any weapons left operational. Sector Absil is reporting mass casualties, and is at 20% combat effectiveness. They are incapable of launching any more fission weapons, and are down to 2 interceptor batteries, a commander said, as another impact caused him to stumble. Sectors Billon, Porters, and Litwi have lost contact with us, and most other sectors have either been wiped out or are combat ineffective. General Tusolk never thought that he would be doing this. 2 days prior to Starfall, his race had never even seriously considered other life to exist in the universe. They had only just begun to colonize their star system, and had little in the way of a stellar navy, apart from a few basic anti-piracy shuttles. Now, they will surely be extinct within a few days, if the intense bombardment keeps pace. Cities across the planet have been flattened, and preliminary reports from surviving sensors showed what can only be a landing force gathering. Each sector on the planet of Tolik was getting hit hard. Tusolk looked about, as rear generals and their remaining command staff scrambled from station to station, issuing desperate orders to bunker down and hold out so long as they had bullets to fire. Others were manning the few sensor relays and optical observation equipment, trying to find a last-ditch escape route or flaw in the bombardment fleet's defenses. Tusolk had to hold back tears, as he knew that they would find none. The enemy was too advanced, too powerful to overcome. It was then when he came up with a bitter idea. Tusolk pulled up a tab on his console and transferred all of the files he had of his people and their history. He added a file of his own, the audio recordings he made that morning, detailing the orbital assault. He then turned to the communication station of the war room. "Commander Prolin, give me an update on any focusing communication arrays that are still operational." A small figure of an officer turned to a cracked screen. "Sir, we have one left in Sector Rec, but contact with it is unstable." Tusolk shook his head, his matted fur coming out from under his officer's cap. "As long as we have contact with this array, we have a shot. Try and send this data package to any available deep space probe satellites." Prolin looked at the files on his station and shuddered. "Sir, why are we sending this to the probes? There isn't anything to gain from doing this." Another impact shook the room, the lights flickering. Tusolk leaned in onto the commander's chair to steady himself. "Look, there isn't much time left for us. If we are to die here, then so be it. However, I will not let all of our knowledge and culture die with us. With this, our people will at least be known, even if we are no longer here." Prolin's ears reared back at that. "You don't mean to say—" Prolin gagged at the thought. "We won't make it, will we?" Tusolk shook his head. "Not for much longer. Do it." Prolin shed a tear, and began to transmit the data to the remaining probe's data storage units. Tusolk grabbed Prolin's shoulder. "Well done, soldier. Carry on with your orders, then report to me when the data transfer is complete." Another jolt shook Tusolk as he stumbled back to the data table in the center of the war room. Brushing off the dust that had fallen from the ceiling, he called for the rear generals to leave the commanding staff at their stations and gather at the table. With each general at the table, Tusolk looked at each with a tired look. He sighed, leaned onto the table, and gave his last briefing. "Here is the situation. We have lost communication with most of the other sectors. The armies we can talk to are either dying or stuck in their bunkers trying not to die. Our weapons are useless. Our defense is sundered. I have just sent a command to our remaining deep space probes. They are set to transmit much of our knowledge and culture, as well as our fate." Tusolk stood up straight, pulling his jacket taut. "There is no hope for our species' survival. If you wish to spend these last days with your family, then you have my leave, and will suffer no loss of your honor. As for me, I will remain here. My birth purpose is to defend my fellow Nawandar, and I will do so as long as I have breath in my lungs and blood in my hearts. I aim to be a thorn in their side for as long as possible, and with any weapons we have. If you wish to stay with me, I will accept any advice or assistance you have at your disposal. If there are no further suggestions or objections, then you are dismissed." The rear generals looked at each other with grim determination. The leftmost one nodded, then looked at Tshirt. "Sir, as your subordinates and your brothers-in-arms, it is our duty to ensure your orders are carried out in the fullest. We shall stand by your side." Tshirt nodded. "It is settled then. Return to your posts. We will reconvene every 2 hours, or if any unforeseen circumstances allow. If we are to die at our posts, then at least we shall die with honor." Tshirt raised his upper arms in salute, the rear generals repeating the gesture in reply. With the end of the briefing, Tshirt went back to his command station. The screen showed the surface, pockmarked by impact craters. Others were pointing at the sky, the distant shadows of the alien bombardment fleet, flickering with what appeared to be railgun fire. He stared at the screens, allowing himself to get lost in his thoughts as he pictured his family. They would have been in the capital when the stars fell. Tshirt shuddered at the thoughts of the bombardment. He knew that even if they lived long enough to get to a public bunker, there was no chance of them surviving such total desolation. The dust and signal instability choked the camera's view of the capital, allowing only the occasional glimpse of the total destruction of the largest city on the planet. Tshirt was shaken back to reality by Prolin, who was almost frantic. "Sir? What do I do?" Tshirt shook his head. "I'm sorry, Commander, what did you say?" Prolin shook his head in nervous confusion. "Sir, we are being held by all of our probes. Something or someone is using them to try and contact us via visual channels. The data format does not match with anything I've ever seen. I think it is alien, but not the ones bombarding us." Tshirt's ears reared back in confusion for a moment, before he collected his thoughts. "Understood. Please route it to the briefing room." Prolin nodded, bowed, and scrambled back to his station. At the briefing room, the main screen was lit up with a standby message, awaiting for Tshirt to accept the hail. With just the slightest hesitation, he accepted the hail. A strange, hairless creature, in what was clearly a military uniform, greeted him in broken common. "Hello? Hello. This is Captain Greville, of the United Terran battleship Providence. Hold the line. Nawandar shall not fall." Captain Falk Greville looked at the haggard figure on his view screen. The general's Vorping figure was warped by the gravity of the situation, the stress evident in the way they barely held their authoritative facade together. It was clear that they were desperate, and rightfully so. It appears that the husk had been ravaging the planets they lived on for a few days now. Falk stood up from his command station, carrying his mobile translator with him. "General, we have a plan. Really, it is a long shot, but it is the best chance you have of survival. We are going to take our ships, land them, and take on survivors. We know where the greatest concentration of survivors are on Tolik. If you have the capability to, I need you to send me the coordinates of the survivors on the Nawandar." The general nodded, and appeared to summon a subordinate from out of view. "Understood. Sending coordinates now. However, I fail to understand how you expect to evacuate 2 entire planets with just your 4 ships. Even if you survive the onslaught by these invaders..." Translation approximated. "I have serious doubts of whether you can carry that many survivors on board your vessels, let alone..." The signal distorted and faded, as the bunker appeared to take another hit from the orbital bombardment. Falk turned to the officers manning the communication station. "Lieutenant Smith, I need you to re-establish communications with the General immediately, using whatever means you see as necessary. Lieutenant Ellis, notify the West African Squadron of the situation at hand. We will need any available vessel to rendezvous with us at these coordinates." Falk turned to the bosun next to the internal communication station. Bosun, sound general quarters and set the ship to condition Z. A chorus of, "Aye, sir," filled the bridge, as the officers executed their commands with practiced efficiency. The distant sound of alarms seeped through the locked doors of the bridge, becoming mute as the room behind the bridge depressurized with a hiss. Back in his command seat, Captain Greville opened a channel on the view screen to the escorting cruisers, Titan, Phobos, and Deimos. T'Sog stood back up, the emergency lights barely visible through the dust of the briefing room. He shook his head, his vision blurred from the concussion. The bunker had taken a direct hit. T'Sog left the briefing room, stumbling into a scene of chaos. Wounded were rushing into the room from the western entrance, desperate to avoid being crushed by tons of falling earth and debris. Grabbing one of the senior officers running in, T'Sog steadied himself for the worst. He did his best to appear calm, but he couldn't help but have a grave sense of dread. "Lieutenant Commander, what has happened?" The officer looked at T'Sog with dismay. "Sir, the western wing of the bunker has taken a direct hit. We don't know how much has collapsed, but the hallway is cut off about 50 meters down." Now able to see that the officer was wounded on 2 of his forearms, T'Sog grimaced. "Understood. See to it that you report to the medical room in the eastern corridor. On the way, find those who are still fit and have them help move the most wounded. My lower command staff will be at your disposal. Go. Time is of the utmost importance." The officer nodded, turned, and ran to the door to the eastern corridor, gathering about a dozen people to help move the unconscious and dying. The desperate cries from mothers and deities were muffled but a little when the door to the eastern corridor closed. T'Sog found it hard to breathe for a brief moment, the edges of his vision darkening into a deep tunnel. Whether it was from the dust, stress, or grief, he didn't want to know. T'Sog sat for a moment to gather his scattered wits and to process the situation. It was then that he bolted up with the sudden realization that he had just lost contact with what could be the last hope for his soldiers and species. "Commander Prolin, I need an update on our communications array. Are we still able to communicate with these Terrans?" T'Sog asked, as he turned to the communication station. Prolin was typing furiously at his console. "Sir, we have lost all signal from the wreck array. Our communications lines to it went through the western corridor, and I assume those lines are severed. I am still receiving audio data from their transmissions on some of our older simplex relays, but we cannot transmit any data or information back to them without rerouting the signal to a transmitter." T'Sog stiffened. "Understood, Commander. Is there any way we can use some of our northern or southern relays to transmit even the most basic data to the Terrans? They require the coordinates of the last known concentrations of survivors." Prolin pulled up 2 tabs on the right screen of the console. "It looks like the northern array has been destroyed, except for some simplex receivers." He looked over to the left screen, and stopped in surprise. "Sir, we have a few digital stations still active in the area. They cannot receive signals from the ranges in consideration, but they should have enough power to transmit a signal." T'Sog stood up, his shoulders held just a bit higher. "Good. Send them this list of coordinates, and inform them of the pending situation here." Commander Prolin nodded, and tersely replied, "Aye, sir." Lieutenant Smith had all but given up by this point. Communications with the Nawanda had been lost for several minutes by now, and the doubts of whether they would receive anything were plaguing his mind. He was about to turn to Captain Greville when a decryption translation notification popped up on screen, the obsolete tones of digital noise playing quietly in Smith's earpiece. With any doubt buried, Smith exclaimed, "Captain, we are receiving a digital signal from the Wanda." Falk hastily went to the communication station to read the message as it was decrypted. "West bunker wing hit with mass casualties. Lost connection with main array. Able to hear audio, can transmit digital only. Sending coordinate data and stable audio signal frequencies." Falk stood up to face each officer as he addressed them. "Lieutenant Ellis, I need you to send those coordinates to the cruisers and the West Africa Squadron as they arrive. Helm, I need the coordinates placed into the autopilot, with priority given to the highest concentration of survivors and the command bunker we have contacted. The bridge crew scrambled to carry out their orders as the data began streaming in. Lieutenant Smith turned to Falk. Should I send a reply, sir? Yes, sir, Falk replied, as the navigational console across the bridge began to issue warnings of multiple Terran warp signatures approaching. Help is on the way.